Seattle, rain, everything as usual. The dull light of the street lamps reflected in the puddles, and the cold wind, cutting through, carried the clouds across the sky, as if in a hurry. I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment, wrapped in a cozy blanket and watching the city, which looked as gray as this day. A familiar yet not boring scene. Wet streets, passers-by with umbrellas, endless traffic. At some point, when the rain no longer seemed ominous, but instead felt cozy, the thought came to me on its own. Why not do something unusual? I thought. Josh and I had always loved traveling, but recently we seemed to be stuck in one place. Work, daily worries, obligations. I started to feel that we needed something new, something that would bring back that spark we once had when we first started building our life together. We needed to break out of the city routine, give ourselves the chance to feel nature, to forget everything for a while. I decided there must be a place where time didn't matter, where we could simply be, enjoy the moment. And then I remembered the mountains. How long had it been since Josh and I had gone to such places? We had always wanted to, but kept putting it off, telling ourselves there would be time later. But now, the time had come. I quickly called Josh. Hey, don't you think it's been a long time since we went somewhere together? I asked, not hiding my excitement. Yeah, you're right, Josh said. I could hear that familiar note in his voice. He was ready for an adventure. What do you have in mind? How about a weekend in the mountains? Somewhere secluded with a view of a lake and a forest. We could bring Tom. He hasn't been with us in a while, and I remember how much he loved hiking. Josh paused for a moment, as if thinking about the proposal. I knew he would be happy. Tom and I always got along well, and over the past few years, we just hadn't managed to meet up. That sounds great. Let's not waste time. We need to plan. How much do we need for such a trip? Everything's almost figured out. I found a great spot. Let's just pack and leave on Friday. He agreed, and I felt something click in my chest. Joy and the anticipation of something new. At that moment, on this wet and gray balcony, I realized that Josh and I were truly ready for something unexpected. When I hung up the phone, the world immediately became brighter. The emptiness that usually fills me during moments of inaction was gone. Josh and I had finally decided that it was time to return to our favorite adventures, and the idea of a weekend in the mountains felt as if it had been there all along, just waiting for someone to dare act on it. I knew this wouldn't be just a trip, but something that would pull us out of our everyday routine and bring back the atmosphere of lightness and joy that we had in the beginning. I called Tom, Josh's old friend from college. Tom was a true adventurer, always ready to set off, always looking for something new. When he picked up, I felt my heart tighten with joy. He was in. This made everything feel even more meaningful. Tom, we have an idea. Josh and I are going to the mountains for the weekend. What do you think? Will you join us? Mountain trails, silence, nature. That's exactly what I need. Of course I'm in. Let's make it an adventure. His voice was full of enthusiasm, and I immediately understood that he wasn't just ready. He was in his element. We started discussing the details, picking a date, agreeing on who would bring what, and dreaming about how wonderful it would be to spend the weekend in one of those secluded corners where everything around is alive with nature, not the concrete jungle of the city. Each of us had our own vision of how it should be, but we were all united by one thing: the desire for fresh experiences and a break from the usual urban hustle. The plan was simple: go to a small mountain cabin, to a place where there would be no worries, just us, the forest, the lake, and the endless mountain peaks that seemed so far away, yet so close, like never before. The journey to the mountains turned into a real revelation for us. We drove, chatting about the old days, what we had been through, and how little time we spent together. I felt how, with each passing kilometer, the lightness that travel brings grew between us. Moments became real gifts. This turn, this path through the trees, and with every curve, I knew we were getting closer to something special. Look how beautiful it is, I said, gazing at the mountains that were slowly becoming visible in the distance. They were majestic and calm, just like the world around us. Josh was so captivated by the landscape that he didn't immediately realize I was speaking to him. Yeah, it's just incredible. I've never been here before. Well, now we will. All of us. Do you hear that sound? Tom stopped by the window and listened to the rustling of the leaves. That's the kind of sound that sticks with you. And so we continued our journey, and with every step, the trip felt more real, and I became more and more convinced that this wouldn't just be a weekend away, but a true reset for us. When we arrived at our destination, the sun was already beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in warm shades of pink and gold. The cabin we arrived at was not quite what I had imagined. It was a wooden house with large windows that offered a breathtaking view of the lake, surrounded by tall forests and mountain peaks. Everything was in line with the sensations I had hoped to experience, but there was still something unexpected. The house seemed to absorb the silence and calm that filled the space around it. Inside, with the scent of wood and freshness in the air, there was an atmosphere of seclusion, like an old diary where you open a page and find forgotten memories. We quickly unpacked and headed outside. A light breeze added a sense of freshness, and the scent of pine wrapped around us like a soft veil. Josh and Tom immediately began discussing where we should go, which path to take, and what was worth seeing. I, on the other hand, simply enjoyed the moment, listening to the silence around me and trying to feel what secrets these forests held. This was a place where every tree, every stone, and every lake felt like home, as if we had come back. "Wow, it's so peaceful here," Tom exclaimed, gazing at the lake, which seemed frozen in absolute silence. "This is just incredible." While Josh and Tom discussed what we would do first, I approached the lake. I stood at the very edge and watched as the water reflected the last rays of the sun. "Let's go already," Josh called us, interrupting my thoughtful state. "This place is amazing, and we still have so much to see." As we walked through the forest, we laughed, joked, and reminisced about our old student days when life was easy and carefree. Tom seemed to miss the city noise a little. He kept trying to play music on his phone, but Josh and I suggested he simply enjoy the moment. And he understood. Here, it was important not to interfere with the natural flow of things, but just to be. We headed to the viewpoint that the locals had mentioned. Fresh air, tall trees, and magnificent views. This is how we spent our first evening, which felt incredibly long and yet fleeting at the same time. We promised ourselves that we would spend more days like this as often as we could. The morning arrived bright and fresh, as if nature itself had decided to gift us with the best day to begin our weekend. The sun's rays filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating the interior and creating an atmosphere of warmth and coziness in the room. Yesterday passed so quickly that I hadn't even had time to realize how this place had become familiar to us. The cabin no longer felt foreign. It had become a part of this secluded corner of the world, where there was no room for worries or hurry. When Josh and I woke up, there was an extraordinary silence outside the window, only the faint rustling of the leaves, as if nature itself were waiting for our next step. Tom, as always, was the first one up, and his energy immediately spread to us. He pulled out the map, studying the routes, and enthusiastically suggested, "Let's head to that viewpoint the locals talked about. They say the view from there is unforgettable." When we left the cabin and started winding our way along the mountain roads, I felt the sense of freedom filling me. A couple of hours later, we arrived at the starting point of our route. I could feel the anticipation building inside me. This trail was like a portal to another world. Silence, only the sounds of nature, and we, a small group, ready to discover everything this land had to offer. We began our ascent, and with each step, new views unfolded before us. At first, we were caught up in casual conversation, laughing and reminiscing about our college days. But with each passing kilometer, the air grew cleaner, and the nature became even more breathtaking. Tom, as always, was ahead, skillfully overcoming the obstacles on the trail. After a few hours, we reached the summit, and I couldn't help but marvel at the view before us. The landscape was fantastic. An immense lake stretched out before us, seeming like a mirror reflecting the sky. The distant mountains looked majestic, and the forests, which surrounded the place like a solid wall, added a sense of mystery and seclusion. Everything was so calm that it was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, we had been driving through city streets surrounded by noisy cars and people. We set up a small picnic sitting on rocks, enjoying the view and the silence. Tom pulled out his old camera, which, according to him, was always with him, and began taking photos. He was certain that this would be one of those moments we'd remember for a long time. We returned to the cabin by evening when the golden rays reappeared on the horizon and the air had become cool and fresh. Inside, we felt a deep sense of contentment. This day had filled me in a way nothing ever had before. Everything was in harmony, in the right order, and it seemed like we had found something important. When we returned to the cabin, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon, and the world around us was filled with a soft golden light. We left our backpacks by the door and, still dressed, stepped out onto the terrace to enjoy the landscape once more. The lake before us gleamed like a mirror, reflecting the sky, while the mountains with their snow-capped peaks stood like sentinels guarding this corner of the world. This place, it feels like it's from another world, Josh said, gazing at the smooth water where the last rays of the sun shimmered. We were meant to come here. I wholeheartedly agreed. My gaze swept over the vast expanse, and I thought that there was only one thing missing: for us to stay here forever, never to return to the city's hustle and the routine cares of life. Here, everything I needed was present: silence, nature, and simple happiness. Just being. We went inside the house to rest for a bit and have a snack before our evening walk. The warmth inside was comforting, and the smell of wood used in the construction added to the sense of coziness. I sat down on the couch with a cup of tea, while Josh and Tom began unpacking their backpacks and taking out the food they had brought. "We could use a little relaxation before our evening walk," Tom suggested. "We've already gotten quite a bit of exercise, and now's a good time to rest." After a while, we decided not to waste any more time and head out for a walk in the forest, because that was our priority: to spend more time outdoors, surrounded by nature. As we gained elevation, we stopped at one of the viewpoints, where an even more majestic panorama unfolded before us. "I thought places like this didn't exist anymore," Josh said, as we began our descent. His voice was full of surprise and gratitude. "It's like we found a lost world." "Yes, and every time I look out here, I feel like something important is happening. We're not just walking, it feels like we're coming home," I added, looking at both of them. Tom smiled, listening to us, and continued walking, savoring the journey. In moments like this, it turned out, it wasn't only the views or the places that mattered, but also the people you shared them with. Josh and I had often talked about how important it was to be together, but now I felt how wonderful it was that we had invited Tom. His energy, his optimism, filled us with new life. We had become part of this place, part of the world that surrounded us. Later, we returned to the cabin to prepare dinner. The air had grown cooler, and the first stars began to appear around us. We built a campfire by the lake and sat around it, enjoying the silence and the warm light of the fire. This was a moment when we didn't want to think about anything, just to sit and be present. Time, it seemed, didn't matter. As expected, the night brought with it not only the cold, but also a wonderful atmosphere that connected us with nature and with those simple joys that only moments like these can provide. We sat by the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood and watching the flames dance in the shadow of the night. It was cozy, peaceful, and it seemed like the whole world had paused, giving way to these quiet yet important moments. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight once again pierced through the cabin windows, I woke up with the feeling that everything around me was filled with a special kind of calm. We had breakfast in silence, enjoying the tranquility that was not interrupted by street noise or phone calls. "So, what's our plan for today?" Josh asked as we stepped out onto the terrace, looking at the lake. "Shall we walk the nearby trails and then maybe do something else?" "I'd just like to go for a walk," I replied after a moment, unsure of what exactly I wanted. but the thought of long walks through the forest where nothing could be heard except the songs of birds and the rustling of leaves made me feel that this was exactly what I needed. Sounds great. Tom, always ready for an adventure, nodded. I'm ready to explore. We walked in silence, savoring each moment. Time, it seemed, had lost its power. We didn't think about what would come tomorrow, didn't make plans, didn't check the clock. All the worries that had built up in the city vanished somewhere far away in our past. You know, this plant can grow up to 20 meters tall, Tom said enthusiastically, pointing to one of the branches. Josh nodded in agreement, though it was clear he would probably forget this, yet he still listened with interest. There was such light, effortless communication between us that it felt like the whole world had shrunk down to this forest and our little trail. It was almost a magical feeling, as if nature was not only welcoming us but also allowing us to be part of something much larger. After a short break, we decided to walk around the lake a bit more, to find something else that might surprise us. Every step in this forest brought new discoveries. Here was a small waterfall, quietly rushing between the stones. There was an old bridge that had probably been there for hundreds of years. This day became a real journey into the unexplored corners of nature, and everything happening around us felt important and necessary. We didn't discuss or plan. We simply walked, enjoying every moment. As we were heading back, I felt how much easier it was to breathe. We built a fire by the lake, sitting around it, listening to its crackling and watching the last rays of the departing day dance on the water. We laughed, shared memories, and told stories that were not only ours, but also the stories of this place. The next morning, we woke up early. The fog hadn't yet cleared, and the air was cool but fresh. The sun was just beginning to break through the thick clouds, painting everything around us in soft pastel hues. We wanted to spend as much time as possible outdoors, so after a quick breakfast, we gathered our things and set out again. This time, we had a plan: to visit the viewpoint we hadn't had time to see yesterday. Along the way, as usual, something unexpected happened. We were walking along the mountain trail discussing what we would do once we reached the summit, when suddenly, just a few meters away from us, a small lake appeared, one we hadn't noticed on our first day. Reaching its shores, we discovered several crystal-clear ponds hidden in the forest. The water was so transparent that we could make out every detail of the underwater world: stones, seaweed, small fish. Well, now we have another place to explore, Josh said, looking around with admiration. We hadn't even settled down to rest when Tom, as always, began looking for adventure. He spotted a few mushrooms on the slope and immediately suggested a competition to see who could gather the most. We all laughed, but the idea caught on so quickly that soon we were indeed racing to see who could collect the most mushrooms in the allotted time. It was surprisingly fun. Tom surged ahead, confident in his abilities, and Josh, despite his calm nature, joined in the game too. We were running around, laughing, stuffing the mushrooms we found into our backpacks, and Tom was already bragging that his haul exceeded everything we had gathered. But the real fun began when we decided to move on. Right in front of us, we stumbled upon an old, almost abandoned rock climbing wall. It was perched on a small ledge, its wooden elements a bit rotted, but overall it looked relatively safe. Josh and I exchanged glances, and it seemed Tom was already ready to conquer the peak. "Whoever reaches the top first wins," Tom declared, winking at us. Amid laughter and jokes, we began our challenge. I wasn't a professional climber, but at some point, an energy surged within me, and I seemed to forget everything else. We climbed the rocks skillfully, using every stone and ledge, trying to outpace each other. Shouts and laughter accompanied us, and even though it was a small competition, it gave us an incredible sense of exhilaration. When we finally reached the summit, we were almost there at the same time. We stood, panting, and looked out at the view before us. Below, we could see not only the lake, but also the forest and mountains that seemed endless. It was one of those moments when, despite all the effort and challenges, you suddenly realize how important these moments are. We stood, almost breathless, enjoying the sight. "This was a real victory," Josh said, laughing. "But in this place, we all win." Tom enjoyed the view for a few more minutes, then suggested we descend and, if possible, head toward a waterfall that, according to him, was nearby. We happily agreed, because with Tom, no matter how far we went, there was always something else to see. After descending the mountain, we headed toward the waterfall, and though it wasn't as large as we had expected, its power and force were palpable. We set up a small picnic at its base, discussing our plans for the remaining days. The silence, broken only by the sound of the water and our laughter, created the feeling that we were in another world, where nothing was unnecessary. At that moment, everything around us seemed so simple and perfect. Everything was easy: our steps, our conversations, and even the cheerful competitions. Time seemed to lose its meaning, and we simply enjoyed the moment, as though we were on an uninhabited planet where every new discovery brought joy. On our way back to the cabin, we decided to stop for a moment and spend the evening by the campfire. After all the excitement, we needed to rest a bit. We sat down, lit the fire, and despite our fatigue, we couldn't stop laughing as we recounted our adventures of the day. There was a lot of noise, fun, and carefree moments, and I felt that it was in these moments, like this one, that the true magic of life reveals itself. The evening turned out to be as magical as the entire day. The sun slowly sank toward the horizon, and the night sky began to fill with stars. We gathered again by the lake, built a fire, and settled around it, enjoying the calmness that could only exist here, in this secluded corner of nature, far away from the world and all its worries. Tom brought his guitar, and as soon as the first chords filled the air, I felt that this night would be something special. The stars above us were bright, and the warm fire created an aura of coziness and magic. Just like in the old stories, where the evening by the fire is always a place for encounters, memories, and revelations. Josh and I sat on logs by the fire, and Tom, without stopping, continued to play his favorite tunes. We sang, laughing, repeating lyrics from songs that had long become our own. And in that moment, it felt as though we were reliving those moments when we first started becoming friends and learning to be together. I haven't felt this light in a long time, Josh said when we finally stopped singing, and only the crackling of the fire broke the silence. Tom nodded, adjusting the strings. He was a serious musician, but now, in this moment, his music was filled with simplicity and sincerity, as if each chord was tied to this place, to this fire, and to us. "It's because here we can just be," I said, feeling how light and free I was, as if nature itself had embraced us. "Everything feels just right." Tom stopped playing and looked at us with a smile. He was always attentive to every word, always adding something to the conversation at the right moment, making everyone feel comfortable and at ease. "So, would you like something else?" he asked. "I remember I have a couple of new songs I've been wanting to show you." We nodded, and he picked up his guitar again. This time, his melody was more serious, deeper. We listened in silence, each word feeling so important, as though it was spoken not only in words, but by everything around us. I struggled to hold back tears because, in that moment, everything around us seemed filled with a special magic, a magic of openness and honesty, when you don't have to hide your thoughts and feelings, when you can just be who you are. At one point, I felt something new in the air, something between Tom and me. His glances as he sang, his quiet words when he explained something. It was so tender and so real. His presence nearby felt warm, making me feel safe, but also a little confused. It was an incredible feeling, as if I was starting to understand him from a completely new perspective, and this discovery made my heart stir. As the evening came to an end, we all felt that the moment should not end. Around us stood silence, which became not just emptiness, but something so vast that it included us, the world, and every word we had spoken. I looked at Tom, and he seemed to feel something too, because his gaze grew a little deeper. We sat close to each other, and I understood that with each moment, with each word of his, with each chord he played, I was beginning to see him differently, with the very eyes I had always been missing. But I knew that for this moment, nothing needed to be explained, because this evening spoke for itself. We sat by the fire, and everything happening was already enough. Everything else, feelings, emotions, thoughts, could be saved for later, for another moment. Right now, only one thing mattered. We were here, next to each other, and nothing else was needed. The evening came quickly, and the world around us began to change its palette, as if this moment wanted to stay with us a little longer. We returned to the cabin, but I didn't want to hurry. Time seemed to slow down, and I was grateful for every moment we spent away from the usual worries. Everything happening around us felt natural and right. We enjoyed every minute: the forest, the lake, the silence. Josh and Tom started joking and laughing, reminiscing about funny stories from college, but I found my gaze constantly returning to Tom. He was sitting a little apart, holding his guitar, but it seemed that all his attention was on me. With each passing moment, I noticed how his gaze grew deeper, and his soft smile became more meaningful. At some point, all the other conversations faded, and I suddenly felt that our conversation was far from over. The silence between us became even more profound. "Are you lost in thought?" Tom asked when he seemed to notice my gaze. He stopped playing, and the same expression I had seen in his eyes the night before appeared on his face. Tom didn't wait. He stood up and walked over to me slowly, as if he knew this was the time that didn't require haste. "I'm glad we're here," he said quietly, so softly that I could barely hear him over the crackling fire. Tom slowly leaned toward me. I didn't pull away, but I also didn't move. Everything around us became completely quiet. He paused for a moment, then kissed me slowly. In the morning, I woke with a slight feeling of confusion, but also with a deep sense of peace. The silence in the cabin was almost complete. The only sounds breaking it were the crackling of the fire in the fireplace and the nature sounds outside, where birds were already joyfully singing, welcoming the new day. I sat at the edge of the bed, and despite the morning freshness, I couldn't shake the thoughts about what had happened. My thoughts swirled in my head, but they weren't anxious or troubling. Everything that had happened felt right. This weekend had turned out to be not just a break from daily life, but a moment that had changed me. When I stepped out onto the terrace, Josh and Tom were already outside. Josh, as usual, was laughing loudly, telling some story about how he and Tom used to argue over small things. But now, sitting by the fire, they understood how much important stuff had been left behind. I joined them, smiling, and felt how easy and comfortable I felt here. We silently enjoyed the early morning until Tom lifted his gaze and met mine. Josh was in his usual mood, chatty, light, and a little carefree. He kept joking and recounting how wonderful the weekend had been. Meanwhile, I noticed how Tom was listening intently, his gaze occasionally returning to me, and it made me feel something special again. It wasn't about words. It was about how we had learned to really see each other, how we began to understand that sometimes all you need is just to be together. We all enjoyed this serenity. When we sat down for breakfast, I realized that these days had changed something important in our perception. This weekend was not just a journey into nature, but a journey into ourselves. We weren't just taking a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. We were discovering new sides of each other, and perhaps even new sides of ourselves. With every moment I spent in these mountains, I began to understand that happiness isn't something you plan or search for. It comes spontaneously. And it's not always tied to big events or defining moments. Sometimes happiness is simply being with those you care about, understanding each other, sharing moments of silence and laughter, looking at the world and realizing how much you have, how much you can feel. When we exchanged one last glance with Tom, I saw the same thought in his eyes that I had just realized myself. We had all changed over these days, and it wasn't something unsettling or frightening. It was a discovery. Perhaps it wasn't as big and grand as other changes in life, but it was sincere and deep. We all gathered to head back to the city, but each of us left here a little different from who we were. And I understood that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something new. After all, true change happens in moments like these, when you don't expect it, when it arrives quietly and unnoticed, but leaves a mark for a lifetime. And the most important thing I realized, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter.